Hello and welcome to the Caspian podcast. I'm Mark Elliott, and with me, I'm delighted to say today, is Tom de Waal. Tom really needs no introduction to anyone that's interested in the Caucasus, but if you are new to the Caucasus, I would suggest you read his marvelous book, which sums up, he calls himself a historian of the present, and this really deals with the issues, up until about 2010. If you're interested in Armenia and the most defining issue in Armenian history, The Great Catastrophe is, again, a must read. But what really got me interested in Tom's work is his classic, The Black Garden. Black Garden referring to Nagorno-Karabakh, Karabakh, Kara, black, and garden is bag in a multitude of languages. Now, just to read you what I wrote in my own book, I said of that book, Black Garden, although its neutrality displeases both sides, the book offers a slight glimmer of optimism in highlighting the human closeness of apparently intractable enemies. And the thing I love about your writing, Tom, is the way that you do manage to see both sides. But doesn't that get you into trouble in itself? I know whenever I try to sound balanced, both sides hate me. Have you found that happening to you?
Well, of course, absolutely, particularly with a conflict as toxic and as polarized as this one. I guess there are many such conflicts in the world, Israel, Palestine, Pakistan, India, and so on. This is definitely up there with the level of discourse, the very polarized narratives about this conflict. So I just happen to be one of the few people who I think has spent a lot of time on both sides of this conflict, in Azerbaijan and on the Armenian side in Armenia and in Karabakh, which, I don't know if you call it neutrality or you just call it multiple perspectives, that I certainly learned the stories and understand the perspectives of both Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And of course, there are different perspectives within that. And yes, it is difficult when people attack you. I think that's it's got worse in the last few years, I think, with the invention of social media and Twitter, which I think Twitter is almost perfectly designed for people with poisonous intentions to kind of throw darts at one another, and also people like me who dare to comment and cover their conflict. So it has got difficult. The last 9 months has been very, very difficult with this Armenia-Azerbaijan war, which is a personal tragedy for me to see so many young people die, to see a failure to resolve this conflict peacefully, and obviously passions inflamed on either side. I guess what sustains me is that for me, this is not just a professional issue. I've been going to these countries since the mid-90s. I have so many colleagues and friends who I keep on good terms with, keep in touch with in these places. So, they're a kind of ballast for me when some unknown stranger denounces me in public.
I certainly feel, I've been writing about the area from a travel perspective since the 90s too, and I feel a certain fellow feeling. In fact, I almost can't believe we haven't met before. But when you read Black Garden, and indeed all of your books, what's wonderful is the way you bring a little bit of your own personality into it, and you give us these tantalizing glimpses of how, what you were up to. And I mean, with Black Garden, we start by you, or at least some of the people you're with, wheeling sort of portable suitcases across the front, the ceasefire line. I mean, I have to say that reading that, I'm absolutely astounded for a start. But I want to know more of the background. What was the situation? How did you end up with a wheelie suitcase in a war zone?
Well, I mean, I suppose nowadays I spent more of my time in my desk, particularly last year, unfortunately, like everybody. But I'm a kind of journalist at heart, I guess, and journalist who wants to go and see things with my own eyes. And when I've done that, I try to convey it. So that this idea of being a historian of the present, someone who, when you haven't seen things, you talk to people, you look in archives and so on, but whenever possible, you go out there and see things for yourself. And this seemed to be such a good way of starting that book, that most people crossing a minefield is a metaphor. In this case, it was actually real. The story there is Kerry Kavanagh, who was still involved in this conflict, a US diplomat who was the co-chair of the Minsk group at that point, did a very, very active push back in 2000, 2001 with Haydar Aliyev and Robert Kocharyan to try and get this sorted, and ended up inviting them to Key West in Florida. There was a meeting which seemed to go quite well, but many loose ends. And to keep up the momentum, he then invited a group of journalists to come with the co-chairs and cross the ceasefire line, which meant that they had to demine it. They had to demine the strip. So we started the day in this refugee camp outside Agdam, talking to IDPs who had been from Agdam. We went to see the ruins of Agdam, which was obviously this horrific sight. And then we got to the line of contact, which is the ceasefire line, actually, walkable across. It really only didn't take us more than, I guess, 20 minutes to walk across. Very overgrown, these thistles and birds. People talk about the North-South Korea 38th parallel, I think, is it 38th parallel, being this wonderful wildlife. Well, already 7 years after the ceasefire, that was the case here, this wildlife zone, which was in the middle of these two armies. We walked across with the Azerbaijani side. We were met by the Karabakh Armenians, met actually by this individual, Vitaly Belasanyan, who's still quite active in Karabakh. There was a rather awkward meeting in the middle. I think we had, as I recall, it's in the book, Azerbaijani caviar and Armenian beer. There was this rather awkward conversations between the two sides. And then within a few minutes, we were on the Armenian Karabakhi side, and then we continued our journey. It was a kind of graphic illustration of the two parallel worlds in these conflicts, sitting side by side with guns trained on one another. And we obviously
because it's unusual in that conflict has always been sort of self-policed, as it were. There were no peacekeepers. Yeah. I mean, personally, was it a terrifying moment, or was there? I mean, I suppose you've been in Chechnya before that, so perhaps.
No, I've never really had any terrifying moments in Karabakh. I mean, I was there always after the war. I mean, obviously in the Caucasus, we'll have terrifying moments with certain drivers or certain incidents on the roads. I think are the most terrifying moments. But yeah, no, the war I covered was the one.
And practically speaking, I know that sort of visiting Karabakh was generally seen as a no-no from the Azerbaijani's point of view without getting special permission. And was that difficult for you as a journalist? And did that become more difficult over time?
It certainly did become more difficult, but I started in the 1990s when it was relatively relaxed. I guess for a long while, and I don't know if it's still true, but both sides tolerated me because I kind of told them what I was up to. When I was going in 2000, which was the year I did the research for Black Garden, I was constantly going back and forth, and I was sort of passing messages, not particularly between officials, but certainly between individuals back and forth. I had this obsession with the town of Shusha, which the Armenians call Shushi, and spent a lot of time meeting people from there, both the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, and ended up passing messages back between people who had been friends there. I collected Karabakh Armenian newspapers and gave them to the presidential administration in Baku. So I think from that point on, they kind of tolerated me. And when I was going to Karabakh, I would always write a note to the Azerbaijani foreign minister, informing them I was going, not asking for permission, but I was informing them I was going. That was good enough, I guess, all those years. Although I haven't been to Karabakh, unfortunately, for many years. I do miss it. I would like to go back. I do think I do have, friends who I 3 or 4 friends I keep in touch with. But yeah, I think the isolation of Karabakh has always been one of the features of this conflict. I think one of the unfortunate features of this conflict, and I did feel a kind of responsibility to kind of say what it was like, what was going on there, what the people there were thinking. So
right now, obviously, things. I mean, a lot of the. I'm looking at a lot of the stuff that you said before the war. You've always sort of been pleading for people to talk, and as you say, the Key West seemed to get very close to a solution. And then there were other times we were quite hopeful in 2018 as well, and then this somehow has slipped away. Do you, now looking at the whole new situation, are you overall optimistic, or so it's gone from being the Armenians being sort of almost complacently victors to it seems to me possibly a danger that the Azerbaijanis might make the same mistake. What are your feelings on this, and how can Azerbaijan build peace?
Well, it's that's far more time is needed to answer that incredibly important question. I don't have all the answers. I mean, my answers would be, obviously, one, I think it's a great tragedy that this war occurred, that these young people, many of whom weren't born when I was actually working on that book,
yes.
were killed, lost their lives fighting this conflict. There's a new generation of which has suffered loss and trauma, and that's obviously put back the cause of peace by itself. Just this new blood, this new trauma. That's the first thing to be said. Secondly, there is an upside to this end of this conflict in that the Azerbaijani IDPs now have the right of return. I mean, it's going to take many years for many of these regions to be habitable again. Massive reconstruction effort. I'm not quite sure that Azerbaijan so far is going about it in the right way. They seem to be picking on bright, shiny objects like airports more than the kind of the bread and butter stuff. But anyway, that will happen eventually, and people will be allowed to go home, and that is huge. Having said that, there are Armenians who were displaced by and lost their homes during this conflict. On the kind of bigger question, the pendulum absolutely has swung all the way back. This time last year, we were still living in a world in which the Armenians dominated. They occupied these Azerbaijani regions. There was this kind of rather arrogant assumption that this could carry on indefinitely. There was this hubris from many Armenians that they didn't really have to do much and that just hold on to these territories. Obviously, they received a very, very bloody and difficult response to that. And now I do fear that we're getting Azerbaijani hubris as well, that they're just pressing their advantage, that they trying to consolidate a new Azerbaijani reality on the ground, which offers the Armenians no territorial autonomy, talks about cultural autonomy, but simultaneously also says, oh, by the way, those Armenian churches in Karabakh, they're not actually Armenian. So that's not really a very reassuring if you're offering cultural autonomy, incidents on the border, even some rather talk which about Zangezur being Azerbaijani territory. How seriously do we take that? Probably not very seriously, but it certainly destabilizes. So yes, I think all that kind of pent up fury and frustration over the years has been translated into what does look rather a hubristic attitude now on the Azerbaijani side. And if you do want peace, it's got to come from both sides. You can't impose peace, as we know from so many situations, and also from what the Armenians did. So yeah, I do worry. We are still a long way from peace. Yeah.
Yes, and do you have any thoughts on the border demarcation issues? I mean, this is something that's been a problem in Central Asia, even amongst friendly countries.
Yeah. I think that it's a painful issue even between peaceful countries. There's obviously an Azerbaijan-Georgia issue over David Georgia. I mean, it does eventually get done, but both sides obviously pick away at it and poke each other. Azerbaijan's poking the Armenians. There is the issue of these enclaves in northern Armenia, which belong to Soviet Azerbaijan and therefore should belong to independent Azerbaijan, but the Armenians took over. There's one Armenian exclave, Azerbaijani territory as well. So that will be difficult to sort out. I think it eventually will. The trouble is, I guess, here is that there's no trust between the sides. So everything is about bargaining, even the smallest issues. These poor Armenian prisoners who were captured after the ceasefire, these young men still in Azerbaijani captivity. They're the subject of bargaining. Minefields, where people, are in danger of being blown up in the occupied territories. Deoccupied territories are a subject of everything. Is about negotiations and bargaining, unfortunately.
Now, the other big factor here, and Gerard Liberidian has talked about this before, how even at the time when the original conflict was at its height, and they managed to end that thing, they didn't want a Russian peacekeeping force,
right.
But now they've got one. What's Russia's game, or is it purely? I mean, is there a strategic move from Russia? Or is this? It seemed like it must have been quite well planned because the peacekeepers were there in a flash.
Yeah.
What is your take on Russia's moves here?
Well, I mean, from my interviews, research on the first war, and talking to others, clearly, this was Russia's goal all along, to have the same Russian peacekeeping presence. Which maybe we should put in quotation marks, in that they had in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, in Karabakh in 1994. They tried that. It was going to be kind of part 2 of the ceasefire deal. Part 1 was a ceasefire. Then the defense ministers went to Moscow, and Pavel Grachev, the Russian defense minister, said, "Okay, now you're getting your Russian peacekeeping force." The Azerbaijanis didn't want it. The Karabakh Armenians actually didn't want it either, and sort of hid behind the Azerbaijanis. The Westerners didn't want it, so they were able to fight that one off. But it's obviously been on the Russian agenda. It's about power projection. It's about getting troops on the ground. It's about being able to sort of manipulate the situation. And obviously the other Russian agenda point, which is a much more positive one, is about opening up communication routes, north-south communication routes, which we're also seeing. So what is Russia's? I think Russia has different agendas here. It's about getting troops on the ground, although I'm not quite sure they know quite where that goes. And there's also a very, very different, this is in a very, very different category of Russian missions, in the sense that there's this 5-year expiration clause on the Russian peacekeeping mission, which means that Azerbaijan has a lot more leverage. So it's also about these communication routes and transport routes down between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. But it's also about Russian prestige. So much of Russian foreign policy is about getting respect, prestige, get our people on the ground, and that's good, and not really kind of working out what happens next, actually.
Well, actually, that slightly swerving away very briefly to Georgia, that reminds me of a story that you told in the Caucasus book. And I would suggest to people that are interested in the Georgian conflicts to read your Caucasus book, which packs in a great deal of very interesting stuff. The thing that I was particularly interested in, apart from the Boney M concert in South Ossetia, which was a bit of a wild card,
half of Boney M. Yeah.
Boney M. It strikes me as, again, one of those lovely touches you bring in. But there was a border market on was it Ergeti or something like that?
Ergeti, yeah.
Ergeti right. Market, which was actually broken up in 2004. But how was the breaking? That seemed to be almost a personality clash between the Georgian leader and the Russian leader, played out through a market closure. Can you just fill people in on that, if they haven't heard of this, what happened and whether that also plays into this way of Russia is thinking?
Well, I think I don't really see that as a Russia story particularly. I mean, Ergeti Market was this wonderful organic market where Georgians and Ossetians and others would trade madly. It was so big that you apparently needed a motorbike to get around it, and all these goods would be traded. It was the biggest wholesale market in the Caucasus. Now, it was obviously also a network, a center of smuggling, and no one was paying customs duties and so on this market, which was definitely a problem. But while that market was open, there was never going to be a Georgian-Ossetian conflict, because the Ossetian economy was completely part of they were feeding organically off each other, Georgia and South Ossetia. So that's not really about
good point,
Russia.
Good point.
It was about Mikhail Saakashvili, the Georgian president, trying to kind of, he wanted to crack down on smuggling and therefore close down the market and and ended up restarting that conflict, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah,
in South Ossetia.
I suppose the point is that the closing of that then drove South Ossetia much more into the Russian camp.
That's right. Yeah,
then Georgia's attempt to regain it pushed Russian backlash. Maybe I'm taking it on a silly direction here, but I suppose you've spent a lot of time in Russia, and I think you've got a better sense of the Russian idea. But I still can't quite ever get in my head, other than prestige, what Russia has to gain from sort of being present in these difficult areas. I mean, the degree to which this is a positive or a negative influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good question, and I think there are some certain assumptions in Russian policy that if you're there on the ground as a sort of imperial, post-imperial in this case, arbiter, negotiator, that gives you power over both sides, which maybe it does, but it also, I think, causes, resentment on both sides. And I think there's, over the long term, I think that the Russian influence in these countries is definitely declining. Russian language use is declining, but certainly, I think the main thing is that the Armenians, Azerbaijanis, certainly Georgians, don't look to Moscow as the metropolis as it was, back 20, 30 years ago, let alone in the Soviet era. They have other places to go to study, to work, to and sort of, so all they see is this kind of Russian power projection, the troops on the ground, which gives them one Russian hard power, but not so much Russian soft power.
Yes, and I think that lack of soft power does seem to be quite sad. I mean, Russia certainly Russia was always very attractive to people in Baku as the cultural place, and it does seem that they have somewhat lost it. Now, finally, looking at the medium-term picture as a way of solving the problems in the Caucasus. I mean, one of the things you've said beautifully is that you'd like to write a cultural book to the Caucasus, underlining the commonalities. And we've just done an article about the song Sari Gelin in Azerbaijani, but the same song appears in Armenian, in Turkish, in Iranian. Looking optimistically, is there a hope that perhaps, as some have suggested, over maybe years, maybe decades, we could hope for something like a sort of mini Benelux, a sort of bringing together of the three nations and putting aside these problems? Or is there some other way that we can hope for a more genuinely peaceful future?
Well, I think the Caucasus, for better or for worse, and many ways for better, will never be Benelux. Let's start there. I mean, this certainly, regional integration through trade would be great, but it's going to be quite a slow process, if only because of these kind of rather oligarchic controlled economies in all three countries, where people control various sectors and don't really want to, are not so interested in cross-border trade, unfortunately. I think if there can be some kind of stability, if Azerbaijan can show a bit more generosity towards the Armenians of Karabakh and not give the impression that they really all want to do is just drive them out. If the Armenia-Azerbaijan relationship can stabilize a bit, then sure. I mean, of course, transport routes are opening up. The north, south, east, west hub that is the Caucasus, possibly a bit overstated, but certainly can raise these economies a bit. As we know, and as we've just been talking about the agnetic market, people, when given the chance, do trade together. They find a lot in common, let alone the cultural aspects, the music, musicians, who are rather a small part of the population, unfortunately. If musicians are running these countries, then it would be a totally different picture for sure. So, there are possibilities, but, unfortunately, politics is so difficult. And the politics of history and of memory is so difficult here, that there's so much layers upon layers of impunity going right back to First World War, Armenian genocide, Soviet takeover, Soviet period, wars of the 1990s. No one has really been held to account for all this. So that's incredibly difficult, and is and
yeah. Well, so what we just
yeah.
So what we'll just have to hope for a trio of musician leaders to come to power. Yeah. Well, with that lovely thought, I'd just like to thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today. You've been listening to the Caspian podcast with Mark Elliott and Tom de Waal. Thanks very much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks very much, Mark.